When we think of corruption, we often think of cruelty. The basic idea is that to be corrupt requires a rejection of the good, a rejection of morality and virtue. What we forget is that to reject something, we must first understand it. Sometimes corruption can creep up on us. We can have a certain philosophy of what is worthy of our attention, coveting the aesthetic in and of itself, without regard for its deeper purpose. This kind of corruption becomes a shadow which guides us, slowly enveloping ourselves, our lives, and all that makes us good. It begins with admiration, a glance held too long on beauty, a desire to preserve what should naturally fade, a subtle shift from appreciating the world to wanting to possess it. It convinces us that the goodness of the world lies in its transience, in its instability, and it's perhaps the most insidious form of corruption. Few works of literature expose this illusion with as much elegance and as much brutality as The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. First published in 1890, it's a Gothic tale of a young man who makes a Faustian bargain. Dorian Gray sells his soul so that his portrait may grow old instead of him. Beneath that premise, the perceptive reader is immediately aware of a darker undertone, which takes shape over the course of the novel. We are drawn into a sort of philosophical autopsy, where the demons of hedonism, materialism, and narcissism wage war against the human. It feels personal. Oscar Wilde converses with the shadow in each one of us, and in his protagonist we come face to face with the worst of our own nature. Dorian Gray is more than just a character. He's our own path to hell. Dorian's fall is foreshadowed by his context. When we first meet him, he seems painfully innocent, and it's precisely this naivete which makes him an easy target. He encounters two opposing forces which inspire a great tension, an angel on one shoulder and a devil on the other. Each of them fight for the role of mentor. The first is the artist, Basil Hallward, who sees in Dorian something sacred, an embodiment of beauty that inspires genuine creation. The second, more dangerous voice is that of Lord Henry Wotton, who influences Dorian with a parasitic zeal. He infects Dorian with a philosophy that masquerades as liberation. He advises, the only way to get rid of a temptation is to yield to it. This is a complete inversion of traditional moral thinking, where restraint becomes vice and indulgence becomes virtue. The gods of discipline bow down to the gods of experience. When I first read this book as a teenager, I was quite taken in by Lord Henry's worldview. I was just at the age where I felt I was becoming the agent in my own life. Doors were opening more quickly than I could evaluate them, and like Dorian, I hoped to walk through them all. For most of us, we can only follow the path of pleasure for so long before our conscience calls us home to the good. But for some, pleasure replaces the good entirely. Lord Henry tells Dorian, nothing can cure the soul but the senses, just as nothing can cure the senses but the soul. What Wilde is doing here is subtle. Lord Henry speaks in paradoxes that feel profound, but when we look a bit closer, they dissolve into aesthetic seduction. Over the course of Dorian's demise, this philosophy reveals itself as a performance, and its lead actor, the deadly sin of lust. The pivotal moment arrives when Dorian sees his portrait. Painted by Basil, it captures more than just his appearance. His innocence, his youth, and his appetites are frozen in time. What we see amidst the brushstrokes is Dorian's true essence. The seed of tragedy is planted. Dorian says, if it were I who was to be always young, and the picture that was to grow old, for that I would give everything. Yes, there's nothing in the whole world I would not give. I would give my soul for that. It's in this moment that we witness the birth of a new god. A god who takes instead of giving, who breathes death instead of life. This is the god of desire. By a salutation made in error, Dorian has awakened a force much greater than him. A simple yet irreversible negotiation severs appearance from reality. And from that point onward, Dorian will live in a world where consequences are invisible, his external self remaining perfect, while his internal self decays in secrecy. This split is supernatural, yet symbolic of a modern idea. The emergence of a divided self, where we nourish our curated surface while depriving our hidden interior. Dorian's life quickly devolves into an experiment of pure sensation. The pursuit of pleasure stems from a byproduct of a life well lived into its primary aim. Pleasure assumes an exalted status, seated at the right hand of desire. This is the central doctrine of hedonist philosophy. The term hedonism was first used in English in the 1820s to refer to the philosophy of ancient Greek schools like the Cyrenaics and Epicureans. Over the following decades, hedonism adopted a more modern sensibility, setting the stage for Oscar Wilde. Through his protagonist, Wilde develops an aesthetic form of hedonism, as Dorian turns life itself into an artwork, collecting experiences, people, and sensations as though they were objects. He writes of Dorian, "He grew more and more enamoured of his own beauty, more and more interested in the corruption of his own soul." This marks the inflection point in the moral arc of Dorian's soul, the point where corruption becomes alluring and sin becomes beautiful. Experience takes on a life of its own. Unmoored from the ordering constraints of good and evil, there is no limit to the depth of Dorian's fall. And although we haven't seen it yet, we sense an eerie foreshadowing of the depravity to come. The Picture of Dorian Gray has an unsettling flavour which can be sensed just as strongly centuries later. Through Dorian, we begin to notice a bridge between classical hedonism and modern materialism. They're two sides of the same coin. When life becomes aestheticized, everything becomes consumable. We ourselves become commodities, our souls slaves to the disembodied consumerist empire, the demon of greed. Dorian surrounds himself with rare perfumes, intricate tapestries, jewels, and music. Each are described in lavish detail, as though accumulation itself were a form of transcendence. As the slow emptying of his humanity becomes tangible, he feels his soul disintegrating. He desperately latches onto material objects as he tries to replace the self he has lost. But it doesn't work. The more he acquires, the less he feels. This is the paradox of materialism. It promises fullness, but delivers emptiness. This promise is echoed in our cognition. You may be familiar with the left brain, right brain distinction, first popularized in the 20th century and expanded upon by neuroscientist Ian McGilchrist. The gist is that each hemisphere of our brain plays a different role in how we think, process, and perceive. In his book The Master and His Emissary, McGilchrist argues that modern society has become dominated by what he calls left brain thinking. This is a mode of cognition that prioritizes abstraction over lived experience, utility over meaning, analysis over presence, and representation over reality. In this model, the left brain interacts not with the world as it is, but with a layer of discrete data which can be measured, analysed, and ultimately bent to our will. This kind of thinking helps us survive, but it isn't especially useful when it comes to the question of a life well lived. Thankfully, we have a second mode of thinking available to us. Dorian Gray's descent into madness reveals what happens when this mode atrophies. He stops living his life and attempts to create it instead. He distances himself from reality through layers of aesthetic mediation. In doing so, he loses contact with something essential, something that can't be captured in a portrait. In classical philosophy, virtue is about a mode of being. To be virtuous, we must listen to our conscience, that voice inside which nudges us towards the good, the true, and the beautiful. We must recognize the moral universe we live in, and fight for the side of the good. In turn, our humanity is rewarded, and the light inside us grows brighter. For Aristotle, virtue is a matter of character, developed through habit, grounded in reality, and oriented towards flourishing. But in Dorian's world, real virtue is hidden away and gathering dust. The good, the true, and the beautiful are usurped by the aesthetic, the performative, and the superficial. His youth and physical beauty shield him from suspicion, and to others he still appears flawless. He's still admired. His outward self becomes a dangerous illusion which threatens to lead others astray, to lock their souls into the same cage and throw away the key. If all that exists is what we can see, what our left brain can describe and categorize, then something which appears good on the surface is truly good. If corruption is invisible, then it doesn't exist. It's a familiar distortion in our modern world of profiles, brands, and curated identities. As our mode of being is dominated by surfaces, the line between presentation and virtue is blurred. Our sense of a deeper purpose, of real meaning and connection, is fading. And just like Dorian, our humanity is fading with it. We no longer ask what someone is, we ask how they appear, how they choose to be seen by us, the images and labels which have become their mascots. We lose the sense of their individuality, and our right brain slowly forgets that human beings are part of that universal magic which defies language and explanation. By limiting how we see the world, we lose the virtue in ourselves. And perhaps even more importantly, we fail to see the virtue in others. When we run this experiment to its end, we risk losing virtue altogether. Not because it has been disproven, but because it has been consumed. At first, Dorian's life seems enviable. But there comes a point where not even he is satisfied by the endless sensation and novelty. The excitement begins to wear off, and so does the distraction that comes with it. Dorian can no longer ignore that feeling of emptiness buried inside. It gnaws at his spirit, gradually eroding his sense of meaning. When pleasure becomes the highest good, it loses its power. It becomes repetitive, predictable, and hollow. On the other side of hedonism, there's something even worse than pain and suffering: existential dread. Dorian begins to feel this, reflecting that each of us has heaven and hell in him. But for him, this realization comes far too late. The hell has already swallowed up the heaven inside him. This descent mirrors the philosophical movement towards existentialism, in which thinkers such as Friedrich Nietzsche warned that the collapse of traditional values would lead to nihilism, the belief that life has no inherent meaning. His famous declaration that God is dead was not a celebration. It was a diagnosis for an illness that is still spreading today. Without a metaphysical framework to ground our morality, the way we form our identity and our relationships breaks down. Values become unstable, and so does the way we see ourselves. In such a vacuum, we have two choices. We can either create our own meaning or face despair. Dorian attempts neither, instead choosing to distract himself, trying to run away from the yawning void hunting him from within. Over time, that distraction only feeds the void, and he faces a fate even worse than despair. As Dorian's external visage remains untouched, the portrait changes. The man in the image, once young and full of light, becomes deformed and monstrous. It's like we're seeing through the looking glass, smoke and mirrors dissipating to reveal the truth that lies beneath. The truth that Dorian refuses to acknowledge. This reality is uncurated and unforgiving, and leads the reader to a curious but shocking insight. This is the forgotten half, the shadow self nurtured by Dorian's sin, and the longer it goes unintegrated, the more powerful it becomes. In psychological terms, the portrait has become a repository for everything he rejects. His true nature is on full display for the first time, and it's even uglier than we imagined. Somewhere in between the man in the story and the man in the portrait is a great chasm, a graveyard of not just virtues, but virtuosity, the cultivation of skill, depth, and mastery for their own sake. In a purely materialistic framework, virtuosity, which is characterized by the pure sense of striving, starts to fade. In Dorian's world, why labour in obscurity when admiration can be won through appearance alone? Why cultivate depth when surface level suffices? The integrity of the work no longer matters when your North Star is a bigger audience, or the grandeur of some spectacle. Hedonism is an intrinsically performative philosophy. Looking at the portrait, Dorian comes face to face with himself. He can't bear what he sees, and attempts to destroy it. Facing the serpent no more, he doesn't realise that he has become it, and can't help but bite his own tail. In destroying the portrait, what he's really destroying is his last pale glimmer of hope, and setting free a lost soul which waits for its reunion with everything human. The servants discover an old, withered body, lying beside a picture of a man flushed with youth, who died before he could ever really live. Dorian Gray's greatest tragedy is that he forgets he ever had a soul to begin with. He forgets the meaning of hope. He really has made a deal with the devil, and the readers are left with one final lesson. Once we sever that part of us that connects us to the good, once we trade the deep pools of meaning for the shiny mirages of accolades, the fertile ground on which we once stood dries up. We can no longer sustain ourselves from within, and instead we must feed off others. We discover that virtue can't be replaced, only borrowed. So consider this a warning. Don't make a deal with the devil. You will lose every time.